Reverb! It can be the difference between a warm, lush mix that wraps you up in a blanket on New Year's Eve and gently kisses you on the cheek, or a thin, sterile abomination of a song that's about as deep as that shallow girl in high school who only dated guys over 6'2". Seriously though, reverb is often overlooked and just slapped onto a mix, but it can really make a huge, huge difference in the depth and vibe of a song. Of course, you don't always need a ton of reverb, but in the right amount, in the right way, it can be magical. So let's talk about reverb. For starters, let's work our way up the reverb technology tree and explore some of its branches. We typically have three main ways of generating reverb. We have acoustical reverb, mechanical reverb, and digital reverb. From these three types, we have a myriad of subtypes, but for the most part, they're all going to be based off of these three principles. The most primitive way of adding reverb is with an acoustic space. Acoustic reverbs are just that, reverbs from actual acoustic spaces. This could be anything. Rooms, halls, churches, stadiums, and in the case of super fancy pants studios, chambers. Chambers are rooms, typically built from some type of hard material like tile or concrete, where the audio is played back through a speaker and recorded through a microphone or a series of microphones. This is like the OG way of adding reverb to a track, and the results are often very natural and realistic sounding because it is a real space. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that most of you watching this video don't have access to a real chamber. If you do, take advantage of that sucker before some shady developer buys it and turns it into a parking lot or a stupid freaking gym. Anyway, you can still use chambers and other acoustic spaces with the help of a convolution reverb like this. I'll get more into convolution reverbs in a bit. Moving on from acoustic reverbs, the next technological step is mechanical reverbs. These are mechanical whiz-bangs where a signal is sent through a physical object that resonates and creates a sort of artificial reverb, which is then recorded. It really boils down to two types, plates and springs. Plates are basically giant metal sheets put under tension with a transducer that vibrates the sheet and a pickup that captures that signal. Plates have a very smooth, dark tone that works really well on a variety of sources, especially drums and vocals. It's a familiar sound that has been used on countless recordings. Springs are a very similar concept, but instead of sending it through a plate, they're sent through a series of little springs called a tank. When you were a kid, if you ever had like a metal slinky toy and like held it up to your ear and slapped it around, that's essentially a spring reverb. These reverbs are much more unpredictable and add this little fluttering sound that's really vibey. They work especially well on anything you want to sound vintage. They're particularly common on guitars and organs. In fact, they were invented by Hammond, as in the Hammond B3 and A100. Now, further up the technological ladder is the advent of digital reverbs, namely the algorithmic reverb. These are fully artificial reverbs created digitally with an algorithm, and they are by far the most flexible and commonly used today. You can basically recreate any acoustic or mechanical reverb sound with the right algorithm, but you can also create spaces that are physically impossible and sounds that are totally out of this world. So on top of halls, chambers, and plates, you can also make crazy stuff like nonlinear reverbs, giant ethereal spaces, and shimmers. Algorithmic reverbs span from legendary hardware units like the Lexicon 480L to modern plugins like Valhalla, FabFilter Pro R, and the reverb that's built into your DAW. In the digital world, we also have convolution or impulse response reverbs. IR reverbs are pretty amazing in that you can take the sound of just about any reverb and create a facsimile of it using an impulse response. And it doesn't even have to be a reverb sound. You can use anything to create a really cool, weird reverb sound. You can use piano sounds, you can use clickety-clankety keys clattering around. The flexibility is outrageous. Now, there are a ton of places online where you can find incredible reverb impulse responses for free, and you can even make your own impulse responses. I'm going to make a separate video just on how to make your own impulse responses. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Now, unfortunately, there's still no free lunch. While impulse response reverbs can be great, they don't always capture the full behavior of a reverb. However, technology is always advancing, and there are some developers putting out super crazy accurate impulse responses. So now that we know about the different types of reverbs, let's take a look at some of the typical features you'll find on a digital reverb, go over some examples, and talk about some plugin suggestions. So here we have Valhalla Vintage Verb. This is a good example of what the typical controls on a reverb are going to look like. Let's walk through them one by one. For starters, right here we have the mix control. Okay, that's going to adjust how much of the reverb versus how much of the dry signal is coming through. So 100%, you're only getting reverb, and at 0%, you're getting no reverb at all. At 50%, you're going to be getting equal amounts of dry signal and reverberated signal. Now, typically, I would recommend running a reverb on a return track or an auxiliary track with the mix at 100%, and you control the wet-dry balance with your send. But for today's purposes, we're going to have the reverbs directly on our tracks just for simplicity's sake. So moving on to pre-delay. Pre-delay is very important in that you can create space between your source and your actual reverb. This is nice because you can really change the size of a room just by adjusting the pre-delay. Next, we have decay. Decay is how long it's going to take that signal to taper off from fully energized to gone entirely. And this setting behaves very differently depending on the actual reverb unit that you're using. Some reverbs have a very sharp tail and some have a very linear curve to the decay. Next, we have our damping section. So this is going to control the decay of the frequencies in the reverb, and in different reverbs, you'll have different numbers of bands that you can dampen. So you can adjust your high frequency here, and you can attenuate that high frequency with this knob here. This helps get some of those high frequency sounds out of the reverb because a lot of times they'll just clutter up the mix if you have a lot of super shiny, bright reverb going on in the track. Next, we have our bass multiplier, which scales the reverb decay time for bass frequencies relative to the decay parameter. Next, we have our shape section. Now, the size knob is going to change the size of our artificial room that we're creating. The attack time is going to affect how sharply that reverb comes in, whether it just starts or it sort of swells in. This can also be used to create a different sense of depth. Next, we have our diffusion controls. This is controlling our reflections. Typically, you'll have early reflections and late reflections. Early reflections are usually much more clear and sharp sounding, and the late reflections are going to be much more smoothed out and washy. Next, we have our modulation controls. Now we have a rate and a depth. Basically, this is a pitch LFO that's going to be modulating the pitch within our reverb. This gives a much more lively sound, and if you increase the depth a lot and maybe turn that rate up, you're going to get a much more chorusy sound as opposed to having no modulation whatsoever at 0% and having a really clean, controlled reverb. So it just kind of depends on the vibe you're going for. Next, we have our EQ section. In Vintage Verb, it's very simple. You just have high cut and low cut. You can use this to dial in the bandwidth of the EQ. It's also really helpful sometimes to put an EQ before your reverb so you can control the balance of that signal before it goes into the reverb, for instance, so you don't have a ton of bass eating up all of that space. There are some other fun little controls in Vintage Verb, and lots of reverbs might have similar settings. So we have mode. Click on this, you will get a list of a bunch of different spaces that you can create. Everything from concert halls to nonlinears, chambers. I'm not going to go through every single one individually, but in Vintage Verb, you can simply click on one that you're interested in, and they'll give you a nice little explanation of that mode down here at the bottom of the plugin. Next, we have our color sections. This basically changes the age of the reverb, if you will. You can go to 1970s, 1980s, and now. Each one is going to have its own amounts of noise and modulation and behave a little bit differently. My favorite of the three is probably 1980s. I also use the other two quite a bit. It just kind of depends on what's working for the track. Try them all out. They're very great. And of course, presets. Listen, there's nothing wrong with using presets, especially as a place to get started. If you're not actually going to use presets in your mix, it's still worth going through them to get a sense of what can be done, because most of the time, presets in a plugin are going to be a pretty good example of what that plugin is capable of doing. So let's take a listen to what this would sound like on a full drum loop. This is all just random crap I found on Splice. I'm going to start with this bone dry drum loop here. Nothing going on. That's as tight as it gets. It's drier than the Sahara Desert. So let's change our mode to room. And I'm going to leave most of the other controls at default. We're just going to turn our mix up and find kind of a good balance for this whole drum loop. See, you can hear it even just a quarter of the way up. It starts to get pretty spicy. So I'm going to keep it down pretty subtle. You can go crazy with reverbs. On a full drum mix, it's usually not the best idea, especially if the kick is in there. Now let's shorten up that decay time. I'm going to cut out some of the lows, maybe up to 200 or so that that kick isn't getting reverberated out as much. Now listen to how the reverb changes when I start to play with this pre-delay. It creates a much more slappy sound as the pre-delay gets longer. And if you bring that all the way down, now this is something I see a lot of newer producers and mixers doing, is taking that pre-delay all the way down, which sometimes works well if you really want to join the reverb with the sound. But adding some pre-delay really creates a sense of space and separates that instrument from the reverb. It also gives the room a bigger feel because it's going to take time for an instrument to leave the source, slap up against a wall, and come back to that microphone. So you can actually calculate the size of the room with the pre-delay alone. You can dial it into your track if you pull up a calculator and you figure out what like a quarter note or a 16th note is. But also, as a general rule of thumb, this isn't exact, but sound travels at approximately 1 foot per millisecond. So if you set this up to 40 milliseconds, it should sound roughly like those walls are 40 feet away. So let's make this maybe more mid-size, drop that down to about 30. Now listen to what happens when we change the size. I'm going to turn this mix up so you can hear it a little bit better. Get more of a bathroom sound, and then if we make it all the way big, now let's play with the attack a little bit. At 100%, you're almost getting a reverse reverb effect. And if you bring it back to 0, it's going to be very slappy. Now let's take a listen to the early reflections and the late reflections by themselves. So this is just early reflections. Hear how bright and clean those are? Now let's switch that to late reflections. much more bouncy, fluttery, washy. Combine the two and you can really, really play with the sound. So let's play with the modulation a little bit. I'm going to turn this all the way up. In a very nuanced way, there is a chorus going on, and not every single hit of those drums is sounding the same through the reverb because the pitch is slowly changing. This can be used to make a reverb feel a little bit more unique and natural and not exact every single time. Let's take a listen to what this can sound like on a guitar. Let's change the color to 1980s and do something crazy like a sanctuary. Now at this point, that reverb is joining with the source material quite a bit. If we increase this pre-delay, it's going to separate it, and we can get this beautiful swell if we play with the attack time and the pre-delay. So even though we have a very high mix setting, it's halfway up, we have a crazy long decay time, we're still able to let that source material cut through because we have that pre-delay turned way up, so it's taking a long time for that to start to develop. Let's play with these vocals for a second.
Too many questions. Too many questions. Too many questions. Too many questions. Too many questions.
Again, that pre-delay time is so important because if I back it up all the way, you're going to hear that it's really conflicting with the vocal.
Too many questions.
It doesn't let them breathe, but if I turn it up,
Too many questions.
not only does it separate the reverb, but it also gives you kind of a sense of delay. And you can dial that into the BPM of the track, and that reverb will disappear into the song, but adds so much vibe. So let's take a listen to what this world's most simple mix sounds like with reverb and without reverb.
Too many questions. Too many questions. Too many questions. Too many questions.
So what plugin is gonna make me a better producer? It's the ear, not the gear. But toys are fun. Come on. For starters, most DAWs have at least one pretty decent reverb built in. I would suggest getting very familiar with the reverbs built into your DAW before you go out and snatch a bunch of different reverbs. Ableton's reverb is great. They've also added a hybrid reverb that combines a convolution reverb with an algorithmic reverb. Space Designer and Logic, Reverb and Pro Tools, Fruity Reverb and FL, chances are pretty high that you have a decent reverb built into your DAW. That being said, let's get into those plugins. The Valhalla plugins, like the one I just showed you, are fantastic and they're super cheap. Vintage Verb is legit. They've also got Room, Supermassive, and Shimmer. If I could only have one algorithmic reverb though, it would probably be FabFilter Pro R. The interface on this reverb is super straightforward and easy to dial in, but there is massive flexibility and most importantly, it sounds very good. For authentic sounding plates, I recommend Soundtoys Little Plate or the UAD EMT140 if you're already in the Universal Audio ecosystem. For convolution reverb, it's really hard to beat the free Max for Live device called Convolution Reverb Pro if you're running Ableton, or something like Wave's IRL or Convolver for a VST option. If you really just want to go ham, I would recommend getting Vintage Verb, Pro R, and some sort of convolution reverb, and you'll be set on reverb plugins for a very long time. I sincerely hope this video was helpful, and if you did find value in it, I would appreciate you subscribing so you don't miss any of my videos, and I'll catch you in the next one.